Hello and welcome back to Climbing Mount Sophia. Today I'm very happy to get to talk to Rick Repetti. Rick is a professor of philosophy at the Kingsborough Community College, which is a college within the City University in New York. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes, there's about 20 some odd colleges in the city university, which is also often referred to by its acronym CUNY.
Okay. All right. Great. So do you live in New York City?
I lived in New York City for most of my life, but in the last 6.5 years or so, I'm in an adjacent town in New Jersey.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, Brooklyn. I lived in Brooklyn for most of my life, and unfortunately, over the last decade or so, it became incredibly expensive to live there and unaffordable. And I was renting, and it was just ridiculous. So I had been in the same building, like a 3-story building with a store beneath our 6-room apartment, paying almost nothing because my family had been in this apartment for over 40 some odd years
Oh,
with
wow.
this old Italian landlord who just liked having people he knew in the building, because in the other family above us, they were very transient, always problems. He was like, never hardly raised our rent. But then he was so old, he wanted to sell the building and just cash in his chips. And he said, I'm so sorry, I have to sell the building. And then we started looking around. It was like, oh, I could go from 6 rooms into a little studio and pay more than what I was paying. So I had to keep expanding my search until I wound up in another state where it was more affordable. But I'm very happy that he did this. He pushed this change on me, because now I have a nice house with a big yard and everything else, and a big garage, and it's a much more. I don't have to look for parking spots every day. This is just one of the little simple practical dimensions of life that, you think, oh, you're being put through some kind of squeezed negative thing, and you come out on the other end and it's way better off than you were before. So just
Yeah.
just a right.
How often that ends up being the case, eh?
Is good. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I had a friend visit us actually this week who has been living in New York City, and she was telling us she's looking for a new apartment and looking at a studio for she's hoping to get a studio for $3,500 a month. I was like, oh man.
Studio. Yeah.
Yeah. Jeez.
Yeah. The funny thing, like, for many years I worked in Manhattan. I don't know if you know New York, but there's 5 boroughs: Manhattan, Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island. So living in Brooklyn, commuting to work in Manhattan would be like an hour on the train, on the subway. Now it's a little less than an hour for me to commute from Jersey to my college in Brooklyn. And I have all this space and property. I'm not throwing money away on rent and everything. And I just thought,
Yeah.
never be possible. But yeah, so
Wonderful.
I'm happy.
So I've gotten to know you a little bit by means of John Vervaeke and the Vervaeke Foundation. You've been doing a lot of work leading meditations and different workshops as a part of the practices in the Vervaeke Foundation. Then I've also just listening to you talk to John a few times, and Guy Senstock, and several other folks. First of all, I've been really grateful for um, your experience and your presence and the way you lead meditations. It's been genuinely deeply helpful. I've been practicing meditation for about 4 years consistently myself, mindfulness, and I've learned a lot from you, so I'm very grateful for that, and I'm excited to get to talk to you today about some of the aspects of mindfulness, and especially just different things around that. So sort of first question, like, how long have you been engaged in mindfulness practices, and sort of like what was that like for you to get into it?
Long story. Uh, Actually, about 50 years now.
Wow.
Yeah. So I'm a little older than I look, because I was a teenager when I picked up meditation by accident. You might have heard this story if you said you've seen me on John Vervaeke's channel, but maybe your listeners, it'll be news to them. So yeah, I was actually, 15-year-old boy flicking through channels on the television set, which we did like this back then, manually. We didn't have remotes yet. Just killing time. And I noticed these two beautiful women in leotards in these sensual poses. And I was a 15-year-old boy with a libido. So that caught my eye. They were beautiful. And they were in these very sensual poses, like, which I learned later on with, oh, this is yoga, I forget what poses they were in that caught my eye, but it's funny that my libido led me to meditation.
Low level Eros, right?
Yeah. So it's all connected, right? So what do you call it? I remember Ram Dass actually joking about seeing a poster once where it was a poster for meditation, and the guy had some beautiful girl and he had his arm around her or something. I forget how he put it, but he said, sometimes that's the attraction. And, I've noticed over the years, spiritual groups that I would go to when I was a teenager, oh, there's these beautiful women. I'm coming back, But so that's like an ordinary, it's funny, but it's true that that's what drew me. So I decided, oh, this is an exercise class. Let me try it. There were other exercise shows on television that I used to watch and follow along, calisthenics and whatnot. So I tried the yoga. And at the end of it, the teacher, there was a man, Richard Hittleman, Yoga for Health. That was the name of the show. And he was verbally instructing these two people who were demonstrating, these two women were demonstrating the poses. And at the end, he had us lying on our backs, put us into a state of deep relaxation. And when it was over, I was enjoying what he had instructed us to do. And I shut the TV off and I went and continued to practice. And what he had us doing was taking our hands like this and putting them on our chest. And as we breathe in, visualize that there's this life force energy, visualize a golden light coming in as you breathe, and collect it in your fingertips as if they're magnets for this energy. And then hold your inhalation, bring your hands up here and release that energy and see the light coming into your forehead. And just keep doing it. And I did this for a while. And it felt like it was real. Like I wasn't imagining it. It felt like, like when you watch a movie and people do a magic thing and they do a ritual and it comes to life. It felt like it was real. And after a while, I literally felt this energy in my head expanding. It literally felt like my head was getting bigger and my body was getting smaller. And then it shifted where my body felt huge and my head felt like a little pin. And then this shifted back and forth a few times. And then puff, like the genie coming out of a bottle, my consciousness just like a vapor lifted up out of my body and was filling the ceiling area like a gas. And I was looking down from this space, like as if I had eyes. It was weird. It made no sense.
Right.
But I was up there looking down at my body and I realized like this, that this is real. It's important. It seemed familiar. Had massive implications for my understanding of reality.
Wow.
But I thought, oh, like you have a spirit and this is what happens when you die. Like all those thoughts came cascading through my head. Like maybe reincarnation is true, all this kind of stuff. Like the whole, whoa, like bam.
I've been here before.
Yeah. And it felt so real that there wasn't a single doubt in my mind. Like I wasn't bullshitting myself. I wasn't making it happen, because you
couldn't have expected it.
Yeah. I was mind blown, literally. And at one point I thought this is incredibly intense and important and real, world shattering for me, worldview shattering. But I remember having a moment of fear and wondering, how do I get back into my body? Did I
Yeah.
die? Did I die? Maybe I held my breath too long or something. And and then I just, like, literally, like you see in the movie, the genie goes right back in the bottle. I felt this energy come right back down and fill my body. And I was lying on the floor, like two bodies superimposed. I felt like the
Mm.
energy and the body were distinct. I remember another thing I forgot to mention. When I was up there, I could see through the objects in my room as
Mm.
if transparent in some way.
Mm. Mhm.
And I saw things under my bed and behind my dresser that had fallen, that I had forgotten about, crumbled up piece of paper and this and that. And because I remember looking around with curiosity. And so after I came to, after I was lying there for a while, eventually I felt like only one of me again. I got up and I went and checked, and those things were there. Now, of course, I have a very philosophical mind. I always have.
Mm.
So I wanted to go check. And then, of course, I realized, well, maybe this is some bizarro hallucination and it triggered a memory. It doesn't mean I didn't know that that was, maybe on some level I know. So I've
Sure.
always some doubts about my experience, my doubts, but they're in a kind of small part of my logical mind that says you're supposed to double check and be a critical thinker.
Mm. Mm.
Even that, when I would do that, it would be just to confirm from that rational point of view, because that the experiences, that was just the first of many, were so real to me that on another level, I didn't have any doubts whatsoever about them. But just the part of my rational mind said, well, you still need to kind of try to confirm this. So that was the first thing that happened to me.
Mm.
And
And look, just to confirm, so with that, okay, I mean, first of all, like, holy cow, as a first experience in meditation, that's amazing. But so you had this experience, and then with the experience, one of the most profound aspects of it was sort of a shift in terms of which is the most relevant in terms of what's really real. It was more, okay, I can feel, and almost like an intuition I'm hearing that, like, this is what's real. And the rational aspect, we're not doing away with it. Like, that's for sure coming on board, because we got to check this. But even if I check it from every angle, it's still real. Okay.
yeah, and you said intuitive. I remember when I first read, well, I went out, I'll jump ahead and then come right back. I went out and got my hands on every book I could on yoga and meditation in the
Okay.
local library, and there weren't many. One of the first books I found was Be Here Now by Ram Dass.
Okay.
And I remember him describing this feeling, even when he was on acid or some other hallucinogen, I don't remember what it was, that there was this intuitive knowing
Mm.
that was somehow or another immediate, self-confirming. I forget the way that he described it, but I remember when I read that, even though it was about psychedelics, that my experience wasn't, I remember thinking he just described this knowing that I had.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I've later come to find other terms like noetic, gnostic, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
After I studied epistemology, I also learned more reasons to doubt it from a rational perspective. Okay, so now coming back, I said I'd jump ahead and then come back to say a little bit more about your direct line of inquiry. Yeah, it felt, the experience was, what John uses this word, ontonormative, more real than real.
Mm-hmm.
A. E. Yeah, it has a self-validating kind of reality to it. Right? Like, it's just, you intuitively know that this is not a hallucination. It's not
Mm-hmm.
fake. This is real. From a logical, epistemological point of view, as a philosopher, I could talk for hours about all the different ways in which that may or may not be a good way of thinking about things, but we'll hold off on that for now. But the point is, that was really super salient and important for me. It was very like an insight. It was a eureka moment. And it made me realize that, okay, I was raised as a Catholic.
Mm.
I had stopped going to church on a regular basis by then, or maybe I still had to go because my parents, occasionally I would go, but I used to have to go to church every
Sure.
Sunday. Um, but I had stopped like doing it on my own and only went when I had to, that kind of thing.
It had sort
And
of become a third party imposed on you at that point already.
like once you start becoming a teenager, you start thinking for yourself, and that doesn't fit anymore. It's like an old pair of clothes or something, whatever. Like, it was imposed on you, and you don't really believe it. And so, but when I had that experience, I thought, well, maybe some of those things in the church story about reality are true.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Maybe the metaphysics, the model of reality that you're learning in school from biology and science and this and that, this kind of rational, empirical oriented view that I was taking on from being educated versus this supernatural, magical thinking that gets ridiculed by the scientists. I had been moving in that direction until I had that experience. So
Okay.
that's what, yeah, like my model of reality, this physicalist model of reality, seems to be at least inaccurate and incomplete. Not necessarily entirely false, but
Sure.
missing to it. And that put me on a path of seeking to try to understand and figure out and grow and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
So now, I mean, you're a philosopher of meditation. You're the editor of the Routledge Handbook on the philosophy of meditation. I mean, if from listening to some of your other videos, I mean, you're sort of attempting, if I understand it correctly, you're attempting to lead or maybe not lead, but bring into the foreground of conversation of a real deep and rigorous exploration of a philosophy of meditation. And so that it's sort of strikes me that maybe like the whole trajectory of your life has been sort of holding these two things, the rational analytic kind of how do we make sense of the world, and this deep sense of noetic connectedness to reality, holding them in a tonos is sort of the attempt that you've been doing. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's ironic. Yes, it's all absolutely correct. But there have been some kind of movements within that trajectory, and it's almost like yin and yang or a pendulum or something, where I move in one direction and then the other, and it's been an endless, almost schizophrenic at times, tonos in me. Because of those experiences, I wound up being led to philosophy as in an also circuitous path, which is something I could talk about if we want to. But then I thought, yeah, I'll pause for a moment to say I had many experiences that were as equally eureka-like, transformative, Gnostic, noetic, it's ontonormative, you name it, all sorts of flow experiences, mystical experiences, altered states, you name it, including paranormal experiences that led me to seriously think that I needed to study philosophy. And in fact, in one of my mystical experiences, I came out of the experience with what felt like a message or a directive that you need to study philosophy so that you can understand and articulate and share languaging around this stuff to people who might not otherwise, that was like a mission. And I remember rejecting that mission. Like it was a kind of almost an omniscience state of banded consciousness that felt like I was in a realm, a holographic realm of intelligibility in which every node was kind of like holographically reflecting all other knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah.
Each thread of it that I touched with my awareness would unfold into all the other ones somehow or another. And yet they all had their own distinct content. And I felt like I was omniscient,
Mm-hmm.
incredible.
Mm-hmm.
And later, years later, I read Plato's Republic about the forms, and I thought maybe that's what I was experiencing. Years later, I read Buddhist and Hindu descriptions about Indra's net, and I remember thinking, oh, yeah, that's an equally accurate description, and maybe
Yeah.
it's the thing. These are way, way ex post facto. But at the time, I just thought I was in like the mind of God or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Something that felt similar to it was in Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. I don't know if you've ever read that book.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about that we have three bodies: a physical body, an astral body, and what he calls a causal body, which is a body in the idea realm, which,
Mm-hmm.
and a description of it, I remember thinking that's that realm that I was in. In any event, it was coming out of that I remember feeling almost like a message. You've seen this, you have to study philosophy, because it was transconceptual, even though it was
Yeah.
intelligible.
Yeah.
Well, like so inadequate
Mm-hmm.
to even describe it. All of these metaphors are, vague hints at what it was like.
Yeah.
And that noetic immediate knowledge that I had in the first this was like 1,000-fold version of that,
Right.
So, but when I came out of it, I remember telling friends of mine who were in my spiritual community about philosophy, and they all said, well, Rick, you're already very philosophical. One of them was always telling me, you should go to college to study philosophy when you get it. Well, I was in high school at the time. And I was like, nah, I don't want to go to college. Like, they don't know what I know. That's how I felt arrogant. Like,
Right. Right.
other kind of stuff that they don't know. It's, I
Sort of a
guess,
spiritual bypassing.
yeah, who knows? So when it was time for me to consider going to college, I went to the local college, Brooklyn College, and I went into the bookstore to look at the philosophy books just to get a sense. And I remember picking up these books, what it was, Aristotle, Descartes, this one, Plato, whatever, and they just didn't ring true for me. They seemed like they were all lost in this linguistic game of analysis. And I just thought, oh, that's a boring as hell. They're not talking about the stuff that I want to find out about. Like, there wasn't anything in there about my experiences, but it was only a random sampling. But still, I put off college for like 8 years after high school.
Mm-hmm.
But then I wound up thinking, oh, I was doing blue collar jobs, making lots of money. But I thought, all right, I was like 26 when I finally decided I have to do something with my mind. It's not all about just making. And I went to college and I thought I'll study cognitive science, because I had been reading a lot of science magazines and Psychology Today and this, and I thought that's sort of interesting. Maybe if we can do this neural link thing, I had that neural link idea, then maybe I could convey my experiences by showing them on a screen. If I learn how to break down the language of thought into, artificial intelligence, that was my dream. I thought, okay. So when I got to college, I started, I wanted to take computer science. I took the intro class, which was easy. But I had to start taking math classes, because to take the computer science program back then, they didn't have visual programming and all drop down menus and all that, and icons. It was all code. And you had to really be good at math. I hadn't done math in like 10 years. I was intuitive in math when I used to do it, but it was kind of like when you forget like a dance that you haven't done in 30 years or something, whatever. So, but what do you call it? I took my first math. I passed all the math entrance exams. So I managed to show that I had learned what I learned, and I was ready to take college math, trig or whatever. I forget what the intro level was. When I took the first class, I was doing like, say, 3 homework problems at night, but I couldn't remember any of these formulas. I was getting out my high school math book and spending 3 hours to do what should have taken me 10 minutes, because I'm a perfectionist, right? And I wanted to remember it. And then I realized at the end of that semester, I got an A in the math class, but it didn't come naturally to me anymore. So I remember thinking, you have to love what you do, but you have to be good at it.
Hmm.
And I don't think I could ever be good at this math again. And I know it's necessary for computer science. And I fell in love with my philosophy class.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, I want to pause.
It was
I
an
want to,
accident. Got back to philosophy. I'm just saying it was a circuitous.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, okay, I want to pause really quickly because there's something, first thing, there's so many things I want to, I love this story. Thank you. This is amazing. Um, the first thing is that there's a lot of resonance that I feel, but for me, this started like 25 instead of 15. Um, my journey sort of started, but there's a lot of similarities for me. And but one of the things is there's this sort of, I think it's just like a raw courage that is required to step into this place that I think you've been speaking from and about this whole time in your story, where you're engaging the tonos, which it is oftentimes a tension between experience and justificatory mechanisms, and sort of not doing away with either one of them, because at times, I mean, at least in my experience, at times that tension can be just like pretty rocking. And I hear you as you're talking about this, even like I hear you having this sense of like, it doesn't strike me that you were ever sort of pantomiming. Even at that point in your life, you were just like, hey, this is where I am. I'm going to do this.
Yeah. The only time that I spent time deliberating consciously about what my next move should be, right? That's not pantomiming, but I mean, everything prior to that just kind of flowed, even though there was tension and whatnot, was when I was deciding at the end of my undergraduate degree. So when I fell in love with philosophy,
Yeah.
I asked the professor, my first philosophy teacher, what can you do with this other than teach philosophy? Because I had given up on the idea of, majoring in philosophy before I even started college. And he said, well, it's a good pre-law major. You can do poli-sci, which you learn about government, or you could do philosophy where you learn how to be a good lawyer because you learn how to reason, analyze, and debate and argue and find fallacies and all that. And I thought, oh yeah, I want those skills. And that's prestigious, and there's good money in it, and my family will be happy about that. And I still cared about what my parents thought. And I thought, okay, that'll be a way for me to justify philosophy to my parents.
Sure.
Also, right when I was finished with high school, I wanted to go to college right away, briefly, and I talked about it with my parents, and my father said, "What major do you want?" And I said, "I don't know. I'm going to take liberal arts and figure it out." And he's like, "No, I'm not going to support you unless you go in with a plan." Right. So I had that in my mind that, well, even though I wasn't living at home anymore, I still had to justify this to my father. So I thought that makes sense. But then at the end of my bachelor's degree, in the last year, when it's the year that you have to decide to go to law school or grad school, as soon as I decided to major in philosophy and become a lawyer, I got a job in a law firm, working in the Xerox department on the midnight shift just to get my foot in the door. And after they got to know me, I became a proofreader there on the day shift and then a paralegal and whatnot. After working with lawyers throughout it took me 5 years to get my bachelor's, not 4, because I was still working full time the whole time.
Wow. Yeah.
Collar background, paying my way. I was like, I don't really want to spend the rest of my life working with lawyers. Now is it philosophy or law school? So I was asking a lot of my professors, what do you think? And I had 2 main mentors, Eric Steinberg and Andrew Wengraf. And Eric had been the chair of our department. He was then at the time like a provost. And he said, well, my brother's a lawyer and he has lots of money, but he never has any time to spend it. He said, but I have the summers off and we have a nice winter break and whatnot. Okay. And my other mentor, he said, he said, well, look, academic politics is so rough that you might want to become a lawyer first if you're going to become a professor. He said was that the academic politics is so bloodthirsty because the stakes are so low, right? It's kind of funny to put it that way. There's fighting over crumbs.
Yeah.
I was really torn for quite a while between those two things. And then I just decided you have to go with what you really love. And so I wound up going to grad school for philosophy. That's the only time that I really had to take a lot of it. It took me a long time and lots of conversations and reflecting on it. But I'm not sure if that's answering your question about the pantomime thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, I suppose I'm referring to that in my own experiences, like the times that I was sort of doing it for show, right? I was sort of pretending to, because, I grew up in this sort of fundamentalist Christianity, and there was a lot of that. There was a lot of, sort of pretend as if you're doing the thing, for whatever reason, whether, sometimes straightforwardly, nefarious reasons.
Or just going through the motions in church, kneeling,
Yeah.
standing, rehearsing, repeating, and your heart isn't in it.
Right.
Your beliefs aren't really in it at some point.
Right.
Yeah.
And I felt like when I look back at my life, like there's significant periods of time where I felt like I was doing that sort of just with my life in general. Like I was just sort of pantomiming my own life without really, like I had sort of some goal. Well, here's a way to talk about this, because this is one of the things I wanted to get to. When you were talking with John, you talked about Metabolition. This sort of, and I've been reading Kierkegaard. I'm really, I feel a lot of resonance with Kierkegaard, and I really enjoy his stuff. I just finished his book, Fear and Trembling, and thinking about the Night of Faith, and the notion of faith has been a huge one for me to dive into, and trying to wrestle with all of this. And for Kierkegaard, he has the three levels: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. And the aesthetic is, in my understanding, the aesthetic is sort of just follows the first order desires. Yeah. And then the ethical has sort of a second order of volitional management, let's say, which they reference to a third party ethical guideline. But then the properly religious has this sort of access to, and this sort of mapped for me across with this metavolitional thing that you were talking about, that comes out of, if I understood you correctly, you were saying, a proper mindfulness practice sort of gives you access to a metavolitional capability where your trajectory towards a higher order good can be shaped such that, and like you can see maybe what the good is that you actually want to go to, and also set an intention toward it, like a meta intention almost, that things will start to coalesce around in these like two lower order frames. And that so I think for most of my life, like there was obviously as a child, it's sort of like you're stuck at the first order. And then as an adult, like you get the second order, but it's all sort of like, I don't want to go to class today, but I'll go to class so I can get my degree, and it's like that level of intentionality versus, no, I want to build my character towards, in say I want to develop more of a participation with the virtue of courage. It's like I can set that metavolitional goal, and then like lower order choices will just sort of coalesce around that.
That was incredibly well said. Maybe next time I'm going to give a talk about that, I will ask you to give the intro and say, this is what Rick is going to say. No, that was really, really very, I like the way that you bring in Kierkegaard's three levels. That's brilliant. And when you were speaking, there's so many of these three levels in different philosophies. One that came to mind is interestingly, but they don't map on exactly the same. Lawrence Kohlberg's 3 levels of moral developmental
Mm,
psychology. With that,
okay. I don't know that, but
yeah. So they teach it even nowadays, I think, in intro psych classes. But like up until maybe around age 7, it's pre-conventional. So that's just totally whatever comes naturally to you as a sensory motor creature in the world of perceptions and desires and stimulus and response. Did that taste good? I want more of it, whatever. Me, satisfying, etc. And then he says conventional is when you've internalized the norms of society, which is more like we rather than just me, right? What it's like group norms, and those are similar to ethical principles or whatever, right? And then he says moral development, not everybody, and it's a minority of people move on to a trans or post-conventional level where they're resolving sometimes their intuitions or their emotions or their philosophical reflections or their reasoning. And he highlighted reasoning, but I would put other things in that category, often conflict with what the cultural norms are.
right.
And so you kind of figure that out on your own and you become an autonomous moral agent. He's not going to
Right.
the 3rd level with Kierkegaard about spirituality.
Right.
But it's just an interesting thing to parallel some of these
Yeah. Yeah.
levels. But the way that you put it, yeah. So I want to have a moment of aporia because I'm not sure if you're asking me to speak to, what are you asking me to speak to?
Well, one of the things
That you said, I love everything that you said, and I'd be happy to speak to it, but maybe you want to direct me in some way?
sure, sure. Well, I guess I'm interested in picking up on the thread of like, well, I just sort of try to existentialize everything to my own life because that's the only thing that's the only way I can sort of like keep oriented. I feel like in a lot of these things because I'm not like I don't have any sort of training in philosophy. It's all just what I can. I mean, I've internalized a lot of John's work, which is something I think, but I've not read a lot of the literature. I don't have the education background, but for me, I find myself having been doing mindfulness on a daily basis for 4 or 5 years now, and really having dove into a lot of aspects of spirituality and philosophy and opening up a lot of these spaces, I find myself like vacillating between periods of time where I can see this sort of metavolitional thing happening and oftentimes even participate in it. Like I can watch in my own life how and it becomes very easy to see whether some aspect of the group dynamic of the ethical is sort of a purity code that needs to be broken in this particular moment, or whether it's something that's a legitimate little, moral thing that I need to engage with. But then at other times, I find myself, no matter how I'm engaged with my practice, even if nothing seems to have changed really in my life that I can point to, I find myself totally unable to access that space. And I'm wondering, just to see, I feel like I get trapped in sort of the second level and can't see that third space as much and can't connect to it. And that's oftentimes really frustrating for me. And I wonder if you could just speak about that a little bit, and maybe if you've had that experience, or like what, yeah, just like that tension when that happens.
Yeah, so let me try to make sure I'm understanding you. Sometimes you feel like you are in a kind of mindset or functioning consciously on a level where you're not constrained by or determined by second order, well, not second order. Well, yeah, this we'll say the first order things are just your almost animal level basic drives and sensory experiences and those kinds of simple activities. And then there's a kind of cultural norms that constrain your behavior and that you're pantomiming or something like that, right? You're just kind of fitting in. And then we'll call it the third level, which is similar to Kierkegaard's spiritual third level, right? Aesthetic, moral, spiritual, right? Where you're aware on that level. And you're somehow or another managing to function well on that level. And that feels right to you. But unfortunately, you find yourself not on that level enough. And you just kind of stuck in the ordinary mode of being an average Joe, following the expected paths and that sort of thing. Is that the kind of
Yeah. And I think that's
okay. So, well, two possible responses. One is to explain that, and the other is maybe prescriptions on how to deal with that. Right? So, explain first. And explain might even include diagnosis. This is the Buddhist for the Four Noble Truths are diagnosis, etiology, prognosis, and prescription.
Okay. Yeah.
With the Four Noble Truths to see that they function as those things.
I can see that. Yeah. And I do medicine, so that works for me.
Medical analysis. You do medicine?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
I work as a physician assistant in cardiology.
There you go. Okay, so this will really resonate for you. Okay, so diagnosis is not exactly the same thing as the Buddhist diagnosis, which applies to almost all pathology, but one more specific to you is just habit and attachment. So you've lived most of your life on the first and second level. The third level is new. So you've cultivated habits. And look, we're social animals too. We want to conform. We kind of need to conform. We want to be recognized and accepted. And this is herd instinct for any kind of social animal, that to be too much, too different, prior to be totally accepted. First, we want to be totally accepted to fit in so that we have all the security of being in the herd, right? But then as human beings, and this is Greg Enriquez, right? We're justificatory beings, right? We're persons, we're primates, we're evolved rational beings. We need to justify. So once we fit in and established security, then we want to stand out, right? Recognized as unique and special and smart or attractive, a good mate, etc. All those different things, right? So it's part of our biology, evolution. It's in our DNA, and it's in all our cultural norms are designed around those forces, right? So it's most important, particularly until you've completely established your life, right? And this is why, like in the Hindu schema, there are stages of life. You set up a family and become secure in the world before you become a spiritual seeker. So there's that. So like that's in your genes, it's in your psyche, it's in your memes, it's in everything that you need to function really well on the first and second level. Third level is new and it's rare. And just like with Kohlberg's and moral development, it's not that everybody gets to the third level. So when you're experimenting with the third level of being, it's new, it's uncertain, and you don't have habits there.
Yeah.
All the stuff is habit. So that's when I said attachment and habit.
Mm-hmm.
We've cultivated modes of functioning with others that shaped our personality, our norms, our volitions, our values, our beliefs, the way we speak and walk and do everything. Is so much of it is habit. And then also we expend less energy on habits than we do on thinking things through new. Right. So position toward habit, turning everything into a habit to condense, metabolic energy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Neurological energy. So this is part of my overall general analysis that almost anybody who's moving into the direction that you and I are moving in, this third level is new, and we don't have habits. We haven't. So that's the diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
We're just not used to it based on civilization. Maybe when we were more shamanic and nomadic tribes and all, maybe it was different. I don't know. That's historical speculation. Because we were much more participatory and procedural back then. Tribal dance and all sorts of ritual and myth and all that. And so maybe we were more functioning on the third level, let's say, back then.
Right.
Civilization and society and everything else. The justificatory mode makes more sense, because when you have large groups like this, you need to manage them by having these kinds of constraints. So that's that diagnosis, and a part of it is etiology, right? Why is it hard for me to be on the third level? And prognosis, it's temporary. There's a cure for this, and the cure is practice.
Yeah.
That's why it's important to have a practice, because it took you decades to cultivate these barnacle-like habits. And it takes a long time to break habits.
Yeah.
That might seem simplistic, but that's my answer to that question.
Yeah.
And practice really works. Here's what's his name? Bruce Alderman and Layman Pascal on the Integral Stage. I was on one of their episodes not long ago where Bruce mentioned a word that Layman and I had never heard, but we both loved: orthopraxy as opposed to orthodoxy. Great. And dox means belief. Orthodox, getting your beliefs right. And now normally we associate orthodox with these are the propositions that you have to believe, right? And these are the norms and behaviors and rules around them, right? But that's one way of looking at it. Whereas in I think you mentioned to me beforehand, before we recorded, that you're interested in Orthodox Christianity. Although they have that right, these are it's a broader conception. The model I prefer is, in Buddhism, right view, and then right intention, and so on. And right might be interpreted as orthodox, because they'll tell you these are the beliefs that are appropriate, and these are the actions that are appropriate, and these are the intentions that are appropriate. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, and so on. Right way to meditate. It's not a moralistic right. And to me, it's not so much, well, there are some traditions where it is orthodox in the regular sense. But for me, it's more like right epistemology would be right view. And many Buddhists will say right doesn't mean moralistic right. It means skillful. And that's the same. So I have an attitude about practice, meditative practices, and not just sitting on the cushion, but all sorts of ecology of practices, where it's not orthodox in the sense of these are the things that you should do or must do, and only these beliefs and practices, but that the practices, like I valorize the practices over the beliefs. And I think John does too. He says propositional tyranny needs to be changed. So he encourages the other 3 Ps: procedural knowing, which is all the ecology of practices are procedures for altering your participatory experience, which then generates altered perspectives, which then create new propositions for you. So out of body experience and my propositions about reality changed immediately. So what I'm saying is, the better part of my personal prescription to you is just keep doing the practices.
Hmm.
Try to try to figure ecology of practices, particularly that get you and doing the other three P's, so that you're integrating these things more and more into the first two levels.
Yeah.
Your erotic or aesthetic, and your normative and justificatory, and public behaviors, all that kind of stuff. Find ways of infusing mindfulness and embodiedness and all of that into those levels of your life, so that there'll be more integration and not so much separation. This only happens in my meditation room, and now I'm out here in the world.
Yeah. No,
landing.
Yeah, absolutely. That, first of all, thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful. For me, that last bit is something that has been a really significant theme for me for the past year. So I'm a new father. I have a 9-month-old daughter, and
that's great.
Thank you. Yeah, it's wonderful. It's been a real joy. It's also been a real journey, especially as someone who's sort of committed to the spiritual journey. Has and is like, I feel like I'm sort of in this place where I've got a lot of connections to a lot of different traditions, but I don't really settle into any one of them. There's not a tradition that I sort of have a home in Christianity in the past sort of sense, I feel. And there's what feels to me like it's becoming more of a tonos and less of a tension, but in connection to Christianity still. I read a lot of my reading recently has been St. Maximus the Confessor and St. Gregory of Nyssa, and these sort of figures. And I'm really wrestling with that. But I don't find a place to set down anywhere. And so it's really been interesting managing all of that. But the thing that has become the most significant for me is, especially that last point that you're talking about, it's like, I don't want to have, I found myself wanting to escape, in a sense, right? Go and do my mindfulness practice and just sort of escape. But now I have a child who demands my attention, and my wife needs more of my attention to help her with these sorts of things going on. And I need that to be embedded and connected in with these practices. They're not opposed to each other, but they're actually interpenetrating and moving through each other. Because, I forget who or where I heard recently somebody was talking about this, but that idea that to be a monk is not the highest calling. It's not actually the highest goal. Right? If the highest goal is to do the most human thing in the most connected way. And I mean, that's what I want. That's what I want to do the thing as deeply as I possibly can do it, and trying to get a daily, I have developed a relationship with DC Schindler, and his mentor in college or graduate school, I think, was Eric Pearl, the great Neoplatonist. And he says that he told him the most philosophical act he's ever done is changing a baby's diaper. And so that's something that's really I just try every time I'm doing that. I'm like, okay, how do I bring all of this into this moment?
Yeah. So yes, that's the challenge for you. And I have 4 little notes that I wrote down, so I don't forget each of the points that I wanted to say that your description triggered in my mind. Number 1, having all these different things pulling you in different directions, particularly my religious background, family, community, friends, expectations. That's that social justificatory thing. I can't just abandon my tradition. Make it a 5th thing. So Rupert Sheldrake, I don't know if you're familiar with him, the morphic resonance guy. When he was in India, he met some guru who he liked, And he was a spiritual seeker. And this guy encouraged him to return to his birth religion, but not pantomiming beliefs that you don't believe anymore, but going there to see what you could excavate that's alive for you and revisiting it with an open heart and an open mind and with respect for your tradition and all that. And he calls this return to your birth religion, not a kind of, what does John say? We don't want to go back. Nostalgia.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can't put the old coat back on, that kind of thing. But he calls it Anabaptism. No, not Anabaptism, Anatheism.
Oh.
So like Anabaptism, but so like try to put on what you can of your early religion. That's one. Number two, as far as the highest calling in life, a couple of thoughts. Of course, Plato suggests that you have to go back into the cave.
Right.
Right. Those are your loved ones in there. And now you've got a baby there. You've certainly got your life partner there. These people matter to you probably more than anything else in the world other than yourself and your other close loved ones, like your siblings or parents or whatever. So, yeah, you have to figure out ways of even if your family members don't get any of this, the attitude that I've had at times in my life with people that are in my life that don't understand a single word of this stuff, and many of them don't, is to try to think of yourself like, okay, like even in every layer of hell in Buddhism, there's a bodhisattva there.
Yeah.
Whose job it is to try to, just the presence of the bodhisattva will have an impact on them. That's the least you could do.
Yeah.
But there's a lot more that you could do. The more present and engaged and centered and grounded and so on, it'll help. But so that's going back into the cave. Another thing is like, changing a diaper. Ram Dass would say he'd come off of a beautiful retreat and then he'd have to take the subway when he was living in New York City with us. He was in my satsang. And that he'd say that's when you find out where you got at the retreat. When someone shoves you out of the way to get in the seat or whatever. Two more stories. Guy at a Zen retreat goes up to the master and says, you know what? I feel like I'm losing my grip on what to believe. All my beliefs are like soap bubbles. When I touch them, they melt. It's all becoming, I have nowhere to stand. I feel like I'm falling, right? And that's when you said you've got all this tonas going and you don't know where do you ground yourself? And the Zen master said, I hope you didn't hear this story before, was falling is good. Landing is the problem. Kind of funny, but there's some meaning to it. In other words, you have to be comfortable in the sense of not being grounded in propositional tyranny, which is a habit, and try to view it that the propositions come last. Right? Trust the procedures, the practices, because you know that they work. They've brought you into these spaces that feel intuitively right. So trust the procedures, trust the experiences, the participation. That'll shift your perspective. And after you're in and out of that third space enough time, the propositions will sort of land and settle on their own, the changes that need to be made. Last thing, it was 4, but it turned out to be 5 little notes that I made. I was co-teaching a course on contemplative ethics with a good friend of mine who was in the same Ram Dass group back in the 70s with me, who's a professor of religion at Vassar College. And because it was contemplative ethics, I was the philosopher, he was the religion guy. We would alternate every other day. We'd begin every class with meditation, and we periodically would talk about wisdom and spiritual traditions and enlightened beings and whatnot. And one student asked once, how can you tell if someone's enlightened? And it was my partner, his name was also Rick Jarrow. It was his day. We would alternate days being in charge, being the primary speaker and teacher. He said, ask their spouse. Right? Because, all these public figures, gurus, teachers, whatever, that when they come on, we don't know the extent to which they're pantomiming what the behavior of an enlightened being or a good teacher is or whatever.
Right.
But when when they spill the milk in the house and lose it, their spouse sees that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, being in a relationship with somebody who you live with, whether it's your spouse or your child or your parent, is a great opportunity. One more thought came to mind. One of my first meditation teacher, Hilda Charlton, and Ram Dass and a third woman were all a trinity of teachers. She made this metaphor once, I forget where she got it from, about like, you're into martial arts, those punching bag that's just got sand in the bottom, and you punch it and it goes down and then it pops back up because of the sand. So there's helium in there and there's sand. She said, we try to put more helium in our spiritual balloons so that we float up into the ethers. But really, we need to focus on the sand. Resolve that, get that all cleared up, and then you'll just float away,
Yeah.
What real spiritual work is. And that's
Yeah.
when you
Yeah.
wow, I just lost it, or I got angry, or that guy cut me off and I sped up to look at him or give him the finger or whatever it is. Like, oh, I want to be this great being who's, on this wonderful, but look at how I'm acting. Right. So you're constantly being tested on your, by ordinary people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're one of them. And, this is part of us having to accept the shadow and deal with the sand in our balloon.
Yeah. It reminds me of Ram Dass's little schmooze they talked about with his neuroses. He talks about, my neuroses, they used to be big things that I would fight against. And it's in a lecture where he's a lot older. And he says, now they haven't gone anywhere. They're all exactly the same. They're just sort of like little schmooze that I just invite over to tea. It's like, oh, here you are. Okay.
Yeah, that's like, yeah. So he's converted, excuse me. It's like internal family systems work, right? All the, the heavy duty stuff, the wrathful deities, all that. You just turn them into your friends, that sort of thing, which is a good piece of advice, practically speaking, from, what's his name? Jack Kornfield. I think it was excellent book, A Path with Heart, big book. I don't know that it's a really good book about this path. Where I think as meditation advice, he says, and you might have even heard me say this at some of our meditations, so I apologize if you're hearing this again. If there's something that's a distraction, that's really a difficult distraction while you're meditating, like a fire alarm or a car horn that won't stop or whatever it is, he said, think of it like somebody ringing your doorbell or banging on your door. If you ignore them after a minute, they may go away. But if they just keep banging on the door, eventually the smart thing to do is to just invite them in for tea, right? And he said, and that's a metaphor, but the idea is turn that into the object of your meditation. And Krishnamurti says similar things where he says, forget all this meditation crap, mantras. You could chant Coca-Cola and brainwash yourself just as easily. Don't bullshit yourself. What should you be doing when you're trying to meditate? Look at your shit.
Yeah.
You get angry or frightened or your ego is involved or whatever. Like, just take a really good look at it. What is it? What's the phenomenology of it? Pay attention to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Pay attention when you're relating to the stinky diaper.
Yeah.
Or whatever it is that you have aversion to. So when you're in these intimate relations with ordinary people or at your job or whatever it is, and there's ordinary human conflict, that's better than the meditation cushion. But don't stop your practices on the cushion. Just bring them off the cushion.
Yeah.
Stamberger, I don't know if you know her. She's in this space. She does this wisdom project thing, which kind of tries to condense all of John's stuff to onboard people who don't know anything about any of this language. It's a nice little course that she has. I took it. John took it, just so we could say it's good. She says she's trying to get meditation off the mat, off the cushion, get people to bring it into their lives. And so she's got a bunch of these wisdom tools right? Which are things that I'm sure you're familiar with, these little practices. Yeah, they work.
Yeah.
But it's like you're a martial arts student, so you could practice a move no matter what it is. If you only do it occasionally, it won't become a habit, whether it's kicking something hard to strengthen your shin or your forearm or whatever it is. The more you do it, the more, what's the thing in neuroscience? If you walk across a lawn diagonally every day, eventually it creates a dirt path.
Yeah.
Same thing with neurosignatures. All right.
Yeah.
Like, I forget the phrase. There's a nifty phrase in neuroscience about the
Mm.
neuron, something, the neurons that fire together, wire together
Oh, yeah.
for a while.
Yeah.
Right. So, thing, the neurons are firing together. You keep doing it. Eventually, they build up a neurosignature. They wire together so that the stimulus or the cue or whatever it is for that, or the intention, you trigger, and bam, the whole thing is automated. Right. And that's saving metabolic energy thing. So that's built into us to do that. So that's why habits, like you practice a certain move in martial arts enough times and it becomes an instinct. So somebody comes at you that way and you know how to block that attack. It just comes out of you automatically. Same thing with all these other practices. The more you practice, the more eventually they become integrated into who you are. And then that thing that you said about metabolitions and mindfulness, this is what I really think is most essential for the seated practice. The more that you sit and watch your volitions arise and trigger emotions and bodily sensations and memories and this and that, you start to see the interconnections there, and you see where those fired together, wired together habits are and how they function. You can make decisions more consciously about redirecting and rerouting those behaviors. Normally, we stimulus response, and it's so much of it is habit. But the more you practice meditation, the more you're looking at the kind of causal functional structure of your psyche, how you've created the kind of being that you are over the decades of your life and your habits, and you can see that it's plastic and moldable, and so when you're in that good space, that meditative space, and something comes up and you can go, oh, that's why I keep getting stuck, because you have an insight. Right. And then because you're in that good space, you can see, okay, I can negatively value that reaction, and I can think of a positive alternative or an antidote. So I disapprove of that volition, I approve of that one. And even just that one little insight, okay, the habit might keep going on, but enough times that you did the habit the wrong way, and then next time you meditate, eventually you realize, okay, I have to, you make more effort, and then you just slowly but surely modify that habitual response. In the meditative space, you get into that place where your volitions aren't determining you as much as you're able to reevaluate, reassign values, remember, and approve of when you lend your volition to volitions. I approve, want that volition, I don't want that one. And you see how you behave, and it's this reciprocal, self-modifying. What did I say when I was talking to John about it when it comes to the self? Every action that you perform is a self-forming action. SFA. You're forming a certain kind of volitional structure. That's who you are. You are nothing but the structure of your volitions and your memories and values and beliefs and all that. But the volitions are the things that have all the motivational. That's what a volition is. They have all the force in them. So it's good to pay attention to them. When you're practicing meditation, you're in a way becoming aware of the self-forming actions and the self-forming volitions, and you can do unself-forming. You're deconditioning just by watching them. This is what a lot of people don't get, how meditation can be so liberating. Just by watching volitions arise without acting on them,
Hmm.
Normally, you smell something tasty and you want to eat it, right? You pass by a pizzeria and you say, I'm going to go in and have a slice. Normally our volitions, we just act on them as they
Yeah.
arise. But by practicing watching them without acting on them, even just that alone creates some psychological space,
Yeah.
creates some distance. I'm the witness of that. I'm not that. I'm the
Yeah.
witness. I have volitions. I am not my volitions.
Right.
I can disapprove of, I can just say, I'm going to fast on those, right? I'm going to fast them,
Yeah.
not act. Practice fasting, whether it's speech, emotion, reaction, desire, no matter what. So that there's a lot of mental freedom. And the more you practice that, the more automatic and effortless it becomes. And eventually, there's a gestalt figure ground shift.
Right. Right.
And you're more and more in flow states where the right kinds of stuff is coming out of you and so on.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So is that a long-winded answer to you?
Oh, yeah. No, that was all wonderful. That's very, very, I mean, I think that, you know, it's so funny because I've learned like my ability to sort of cognitively get concepts and install them and assent to them is outstrips my practical felt sense of uptaking them, obviously. And so, that
Everybody.
yeah. So it's like,
Read
man,
some
I'll
kind
be
of book about how to break a habit. That makes great sense, but you don't implement it.
yeah,
That kind of.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I sort of my central thing now is like I don't want to pantomime. I don't want to bullshit myself. Like I'm very like that's the one thing that I for sure will not do. And so, it's just sort of rolling around in the mud a little bit, right? Like trying to work with these things. So I really appreciate all of that framing. Like I think that was very helpful. Yeah, it's very
Framing
helpful for me.
framing is everything. I think John used an example. I'm not sure, or if it's my example of the concept that I've heard him use about framing. So I don't want to misattribute this to him if it was my example, but the idea is his about reframing. If you have terrible cramps in your thighs and calves and your hips and knees are killing you and your arches and your feet and whatnot, and you can't attribute it to anything, you're going to be afraid and think that you have some kind of serious problem. But if you've been training for a marathon and you know that whenever you train for the marathon, that happens, you go, oh, that's just, no pain, no gain that comes with it. The framing makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah.
So your awareness of where you are in your journey is the right frame.
Yeah.
It's okay to be what you said in the mud or whatever, and tonas and this and that, and I want to, but I'm not. You're aware of it.
Yeah.
Awareness is the key, man.
Yeah.
No, awareness is the first step in every 12-step recovery program.
Yeah.
It's in all kinds of psychotherapy, just bringing things into awareness. So you not only brought them into awareness, but you've got a lot of great framing
Mm-hmm.
that and it makes perfect sense. This 4 years you've been practicing mindfulness, etc. It all kind of is appropriate for how long you are, your age, etc.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're doing great.
Well, I appreciate that. That's kind of you to say. And I think it'll probably be, I hope it will be helpful for a lot of the people who watch my channel. Cause I think a lot of the folks that I've gotten to meet and folks who engage with the stuff that I put out, they're sort of in a similar kind of place. And I think,
trust the process, trust yourself.
Yeah.
And trust your doubts, trust your uncertainty, trust your confusion. There's really valid information in there. You're
Right.
like, oh, I don't feel grounded. I don't know what to believe. That good.
Yeah.
good, because landing is bad.
Yeah.
Beware of landing, because this is a tension in our culture. I don't know if I would use the word tonos, but in individuals like you, it's a wholesome tonos. But in our culture, there's a tendency for people to want to always appear like they know exactly what they're talking about, what they're doing, to be confident, strength of their convictions. I'll give an exaggerated version of it. Somebody says, whatever it is, proposition P, they say P, and they say, I'm absolutely certain of that. No army of intellectuals or philosophers or geniuses could talk me out of it, right? And I even have a relative who said something like that to me once, right, about some political issue or something. And I remember thinking this, but I didn't share this with them. But I do teach this to my students when we talk about this particular issue. Okay, our brains, our minds, one of our primary functions is to detect reality, right? We form beliefs to represent reality, which are like maps of reality, right? So we are sensing reality and representing it in our minds, right? A map, belief map. This is analogous to, I make a very simple analogy. Think of a weather vane on top of a house, points north, south, east, west. Its job is to detect the wind and display the wind, right? So if it's detecting the wind, if it's not frozen or rusted or whatever, it moves when the wind hits it and it's pointing, right? Similarly, our belief forming mechanism is supposed to detect reality and reflect it in our beliefs, right?
Yep.
So when you say, my weather vane is never going to move again,
Yep.
the average person thinks, wow, that guy is really, he knows, he's
Yeah.
convicted, and he's bragging that his mind isn't working anymore. He realize it. He just doesn't realize.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that framing of dogmatism. Yes.
So yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah.
But we're uncomfortable admitting what we don't know. Thank you, Socrates, for reframing that as the seed of wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Aporia is good, not knowing.
Yeah. Yes. Well,
You might get on an elevator and somebody says to you, wow, did you catch that game last night? They really kick it. And you're like, I don't follow sports. Most people would just go, yeah, whatever, afraid to admit that they don't know something.
right.
There's this tremendous, that's that normative justificatory thing where we all need to act like we know. That's that pantomime thing, right? We're afraid to admit, oh, I'm not somebody in your world. I don't know anything about that.
Yeah.
Right. So that a lot of the uncertainty that people, like you said, you and many of your listeners feel this uncertainty. In our space, that's good.
Yeah.
On the elevator with the sports commentary, maybe it's not so good, right? So, right, yeah. Be mindful about when you and where there are social circumstances under which it's inappropriate to, brag about your ignorance.
Right.
Be judicious about that. That's this thing about virtue, right?
Yeah.
Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius, A, B, and C. Aristotle, A, Buddha, B, Confucius, C.
Nice.
This comes from Marinoff, the founder of one of the founders of philosophical counseling in the United States. He calls it the ABCs of virtue ethics.
Nice.
Aristotle, Confucius. They all had the same idea about a midpoint between two extremes.
Yeah.
So no matter what it is, there's a right calibration under the circumstances. And Aristotle had this midpoint idea, but he added what he called the right rule, which was like a half a dozen factors. Do the right thing at the right time with the right people for the right reason under the right circumstances. I forget what all the rights are, but like that's always fluid and changing. There are no algorithms for this.
Yeah.
Right. So, use your judgment, but aporia about where you are on a spiritual path is really important and good.
Yeah.
And
You can't.
trust your uncertainty. Like I
Yeah.
say, trust your doubts, but doubts are kind of like uncertain. If I doubt something, I'm uncertain of it. If I know something, I'm certain of it. They're at opposite extremes. But doubting is good.
Yeah. It's like something like aporia is the gateway to optimal grip.
Exactly. Very good. I couldn't have put it better myself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Aporia, you can't find what Aristotle's talking about. If
Right.
you come in with a dogmatic view, an algorithm, some kind of proposition that always says this is how it ought to be, that's the guy bragging about his weather vane not working.
I love that. I love that analogy. Well, this seems like a good place to land the plane.
Yeah,
I'd like to so one plug, um please go check out awakeningtomeaning.com. That's the website, correct? Do I have that right?
yeah.
Um
And vervaekfoundation.org can
yep.
get you there. So awakentomeaning.com has Monday to Thursday these half-hour drop-in practices called Starter Ecology of Practices, SEOPs. They're just half hours to onboard people who don't have an ecology of practices. And it's the DIME, DIME method or framework. D for dialogue, I for imaginal, M for mindful or meditative, and E for embodiment. So we have one of each. The Mondays is the D, which is what is it called? Authentic relating, which are dialogical practices. I think Tuesday is journaling, which involves some sort of imaginal work. Wednesday is meditation, and Thursday embodiment is so far I'm teaching yoga classes. I do the meditations along with a couple of other people. The embodiment, I'm doing yoga. Seth Dellinger is doing Feldenkrais work, and Tataya Bailey does something that's similar to Feldenkrais. I don't know if she's given a name to it, but it's really cool. I've done that. And then on Fridays, independent of those DIME things, and prior, maybe a couple of months prior to that, they just began about a month ago. I've been doing a Vervaeke Foundation meditation and Q&A thing. And that's where I think I met you, Ken.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And I think that's something you get access to if you're a supporter of the Vervaeke Foundation, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. And families and friends of people, I think, are also invited to come for free. I think the lowest membership, Patreon supporter, to be a patron of the Vervaeke Foundation and support its work is something like $4 a month.
Yeah. 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 And I
access to those
yeah.
Friday meditations. And I think that we have a Q&A. We said we'd go from 9 to 10, maybe a half hour at most meditation, and then a half hour Q&A, but we frequently go to 10:30, sometimes even 11, just doing Q&A because people love to talk about, their experiences and their questions about meditation. And it's forming a nice little Sangha kind of atmosphere there where there's about 20 some odd people coming currently. We're all getting to know each other. It's really great.
Yeah.
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 Well, thank you so much, Rick, and I so much appreciate your time and just everything and who you are.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed our conversation. I'd love to come back at some point.
Oh, absolutely. I'll look forward to it. All
All
right.
right. Thank you, Ken.